Guilt can be a lot to deal with. I'm sure at one moment in your life you would feel guilty about something, even as small as eating the last slice of pizza at a party. Guilt can weigh quite heavily on anyone's mind, leading to a restless night of sleep, keeping them more awake than any over-caffeinated energy drink ever could. Eventually the morning sun would shine through the window as to remind them of a night of plagued thoughts, as if to say this may not be the last of those restless nights. But what if guilt was part of your job? What if it was your norm? You may try to justify it by just saying you're doing your job so you can live a better life, but the guilt will begin to pile up day after day, and those restless nights could lead to something much, much worse. Guilt is a big theme behind this $5 horror game I found on Steam. It shows the true horror of guilt and what can happen if you continue to ignore it again and again, eventually swallowing you whole. So sit back and relax. My name is Noah, and it's time for a $5 review of the 2D horror game, Distraint.
Also, no one came forward and said they heard it either.
We're introduced to Price, a young man trying to better himself and his career by trying to earn a partnership in the company he works for. Price is tasked to evict 3 different properties, starting with a sweet old lady named Mrs. Goodwin. Price meets with Mrs. Goodwin and tells her she has 30 days to leave the property. After leaving the apartment, spooky shenanigans begin to ensue. Price then begins to feel the weight of his actions as he is psychologically tormented. We see visions of terrifying monsters, Price's dead parents, and other horrific imagery. In the end, will Price own up to his own guilt and see the light, or simply become a cold, harsh monster like the bosses he works for?
I was not aware of any major errors at all. I knew that there was a bit of a mistake.
You explore and talk to NPCs along with finding items to help you progress through each area as you get to take in every part of the environment. Each area is kind of like a point-and-click adventure where you gather different items to solve several puzzles. Most of the puzzles are pretty self-explanatory, with some being a little weird, like getting salt out of a safe to put into a coffee machine. There are certain segments as well where the gameplay is used to immerse you in the horror, specifically through the controls. All you can do is move left and right, along with interacting with some objects. Nothing too complicated. I mean, this isn't Marvel vs. Capcom.
What the?
Who is it?
It's Wooly! He's yelling something!
Tell him to fuck off!
Oh, goddamn!
These simple controls can actually add a lot, since you feel like a regular guy. I mean, you aren't Zero doing clone loops in the corner, so whenever you see spooky shit, you're scared, because all you can do is run. You're basically helpless. Since the game's pretty simple, the highlight really isn't the gameplay, it's more of the atmosphere and the storytelling. But the game does do an extra job being that vehicle to guide you through all those things. And personally, I think it does a great job at that.
I didn't even realize that I said I was misspoken on the air.
Before I get into the presentation, I played the deluxe version, so I'll be discussing those visuals in that presentation. The game clearly takes a big inspiration from Silent Hill, and maybe a little bit from Lone Survivor. You can tell through the atmosphere, sound design, and mostly the themes of the game as well. It definitely borrows some elements, but it feels like its own unique game instead of just being a copy and paste horror game. All the environments have a lot of care put into them, and along with a lot of details to make them feel more condemned and poorly kept. For example, stuff like torn wallpaper, stained doors, and sometimes these white specks that look like moths moving around in the still air. I think the best area in the game is probably the forest. It's quite haunting with all these twisted trees and mangled bushes sitting around the path. There are some cool details added to the forest to make it feel much more realistic. Even though all we can see in the background is a wall of leaves, there are these openings in our path, making it feel like if given the option, it could lead deeper into the eerie forest. The last game I reviewed had very boring backdrops, which made the game's presentation feel quite stale, but here, the background is used to build atmosphere along with giving these areas a lot of personality. The background is normally dark, so the use of orange and blue lights stick out very well, and can bring a sense of dread, along with sometimes bringing a sense of comfort depending on the area. The sound design makes these places feel abandoned and quite spooky. It brings a feeling of I shouldn't be here and no one should have to live here. Some sound effects in general are just super satisfying to hear. The opening of a door, the crawl of text in a speech bubble, the sound of rain hitting the pavement. All fits the mood of the game. The music is fantastic. Sometimes it can sound harsh and haunting, and other times it can be soft and quite comforting. One of my favorite songs is called Bosses. It sounds like a job well done, but the job was a dirty one. I also like how it's presented with these 3 jerks dancing around their piles of money. Another one of my favorite songs is called Parents. It sounds goofy and fun, but there's these harsh notes and these crescendoing strings that make it feel like something else is going on here. Later on, the track is actually revisited, and it sounds twisted and mangled compared to the original. I think all the elements are used very well, but not just on their own. They're also used to lift up the other elements of the game, making the game's presentation feel so much better and help tell a great story.
They also did not hear the people in the control room.
Price is a pretty interesting character. From what we can tell, he isn't that bad of a guy. He's polite and kind to each person he has to evict and tries to help them out as much as he can. We can see that he doesn't enjoy his job and he's just doing what he has to so he can make a living. We get to see the apartment that Price lives in, and to be honest, it's pretty shitty. The water barely works, the place isn't well kept, and he doesn't have that much room at all. We feel bad for Price because he's just doing what he has to better himself. But when it's at the cost of others, you begin to question Price and wonder if his head's actually in the right place. As the story goes on, guilt begins to weigh heavily on Price's mind as different visions come to life. We see his dead parents at the kitchen table, a corpse of a suicide victim follows us around, and also random knocks at the door, along with a few other things. Price continues to try and convince himself he's doing the right thing, but the visions he sees are warnings that are trying to steer him away from the path he's on. The main example being his dead parents. Whenever they show up, they tell Price that he is better than this and that he's not being the son that they raised. We can see that they care for him and they can see the good in him just like we do. After the second eviction of Mr. Taylor, we get a phone call the next day. Mrs. Goodwin's in the retirement home since she has nowhere else to go and has recently had a stroke. Price heads over to the retirement home, and after we solve a couple puzzles, we get to see Mrs. Goodwin. She's very happy to see Price, even though he was the one who sent her to this awful place. And I mean, it's really terrible. We find skeletal remains in a barred off room, the power shuts off randomly, and this guy's just casually grinding up corpses. Price begs for forgiveness, and Mrs. Goodwin accepts his apology with no hesitation. She tells Price not to blame himself and comforts him, even though she is the one living in this horrid place. She's lived a long and happy life, and I feel like she wants the same for Price. After everything's said and done, we have one last person to evict. So moving on. Wait, is that a spoiler? Oh shit, there's another one. I feel like this might be hinting at something.
At 5:45 on Friday evening when it occurred.
After we do some hard drugs, hire a band, and party with our third evicted tenant, J-Bomb! The next morning, Price gets up and reads obituaries. He finds out in the paper that Mrs. Goodwin has passed away, and Price's guilt finally takes hold as he begins to realize the consequences of his actions. Price visits her grave during a cloudy, rainy day. Price goes to her grave and then begins to confess his guilt. As Price confesses, the heavy rain begins to stop. The clouds part and the sun begins to shine. Price says that he will quit his job and try and live a better life that doesn't involve hurting people. He leaves Mrs. Goodwin, but not without leaving one more gift: a lantern with a bright orange light to guide her way into the afterlife. Price has seen the error of his ways and is ready to face the music and resign from the company. Price heads over to the office the next day, and after we solve a couple of puzzles, we are transported to a dark, desolate void. Luckily, Mrs. Goodwin's ghost appears before us, along with these orange lights that match the lantern that we place on her grave. She guides Price out of the darkness, leading to these double doors as Price is ready to face his bosses. I really enjoy the scene because it represents Price leaving his own personal hell thanks to Mrs. Goodwin. Sadly though, sometimes stories don't end the way we want them to. Price sees his name on the company sign and decides to keep the job as he is given into his greed. We then cut back to Price's apartment. We then find out that he wasn't just narrating the story for us, but also for a young man who was there to evict Price just like the people he evicted before. But before we continue any further, let's rewind. So I mentioned earlier that we left a lantern for Mrs. Goodwin. Well, Mrs. Goodwin has always had an orange comforting light around her, and the same goes for the stoic and understanding Mr. Taylor who lives in the forest. The light is like a holy presence that stays with these two because even though when they lose their homes and lose pretty much everything, they know that they'll be okay. But the third person we evict doesn't have an orange light with them. It's foreshadowed right in front of us that Price's greed will get the better of him, just like J-Bomb. Hey, please, no more air horn. It doesn't really match the mood here. Okay, J-Bomb apparently— That's not fun. God, he's gonna be homeless. J-Bomb apparently was a DJ who made decent money considering the fact that he lives in a penthouse. And considering everything, there's a good chance he got this place at the expense of others, just like Price. Instead of owning up to the guilt, he just represses it with drugs and alcohol. At least that's how I see it. Price is doing the same thing as he's drinking a bottle of alcohol as he retells the story. Price is then told he has 30 days to leave the property as he faces the same fate as those he's evicted before. Price, with no one in his life and nowhere to go, decides to take his own life. I actually really enjoyed the ending. I think if the ending was any different and ended with Price quitting his job, it wouldn't have hit me as hard as it did once I heard the gunshot from down the hall. Every element of this game is used very well and brings a cohesive and engaging experience. Great use of sound and music, excellent art direction and environmental design, along with a memorable story that makes this a great buy for $5. I definitely recommend this game and I had a great time with it. If you're a fan of horror games, you should definitely check this out. Hey, this is Noah. Thank you again for watching. As always, if you want to support the channel, do the usual: like, comment, subscribe, and do all that. Also, if you're interested in more content, me and my friends have a podcast called the Dank Podcast on iTunes, Spotify, pretty much anywhere where podcasts are. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.